Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and I'm doing a test for the Astrology podcast of a live stream using YouTube. And the goal is tomorrow, Kelly Surtees and I are going to record an episode where we um, basically take questions from the audience and we basically read charts. So what we're going to do is basically ask people to send in their birth data and to send in questions that they have, like a single specific question, either about their birth chart or about their life in general. And then we're going to try to answer those questions using our general approach. So one of the things that I wanted to test here tonight is just live streaming it to YouTube and seeing what the latency is with that, and if the chat box works, and if we can accept questions and other things like that successfully using that live stream service. So what you want to do, if there's anybody who wants to submit a question, is send me an email. My email address is astrologue@gmail.com. If you can't spell that, you can find it on my website, which is chrisbrennanastrologer.com. Just go to the contact page. And just send me an email and title it. The title for the submission should be Birth Chart Question for Podcast. And give me first your birth data and make sure you write out your birth data and don't use any abbreviations. And then also write out maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs tops with your question. So just 1 or 2 paragraphs. I want people to keep it concise because we have to read it live on air. And if you write like an essay, then we're probably going to skip your question. So try to keep it concise and to the point. Background information is helpful or can be helpful, but if you go into too many details without keeping it brief, then it's just going to be too much for us to go through. Let's see. So let me see if we have any questions or how the live stream is doing. All right. Hey, we've got Ashwin Balaji. We've got 1 viewer. Thanks for joining me tonight. Let me go ahead and post this to Facebook. So maybe I could do a test run of this whole birth chart questions thing. So if anybody has any questions about their birth chart, you have to be comfortable sharing your data. But if you have a very brief question about your birth chart, go ahead and post it in the chat, the super chat on YouTube. And then maybe I can throw up your chart and we'll see if that works. But let me go ahead and share this link on Facebook. And we'll see if we can get a few more people in here to help me test this out. All right, so it says there's 14, 15 people watching right now. So for those just getting here, I'm doing a test to read some charts, and I would like to get some charts from the audience just to see what kind of questions that you have and if I could answer them by throwing your chart up on the screen. So let me go ahead and share the chart for the moment just so we can see how that looks. All right, so this is supposed to be the chart for right now. So here in Denver, we've got Scorpio rising. The moon has just conjoined Jupiter and it's separating from a conjunction with Jupiter and Scorpio. In Denver, both of those planets are just about to rise over the eastern horizon, while the sun has just recently set over the western horizon in Taurus. So one person, Arian, has a question. Yeah, that might be a good question. I think I got a similar question that I'm going to do tomorrow. Could you give me your birth data, or would you feel comfortable sharing your birth data so I can take a look at it? So the question is, I was wondering about sect. He says, my sun is above the ascendant-descendant line, but the sun had technically gone down about 10 minutes before I was born. Does the closeness to sunset have any significance? Okay. Let me go ahead and cast the chart. All right, so your birth date is October 12th, 1984, 6:30 p.m. Is that for sure? That looks like it might be a rounded time. Is that from your birth certificate or is that from memory? That's one thing every astrologer has to ask, or every astrologer should ask when they see a time that's rounded, especially to the half hour and sometimes even to the quarter of an hour. All right, so here is the chart. Having some problems pulling it up. Hold on a second. All right, there it is. So all right, so this is Arian's. Okay, he says that it's from memory, supposedly very close to accurate within 10 minutes. If at all possible, I mean, it's not always possible, but if you have any possibility of having a written record, or if you can find it's on some people's birth certificates, I would definitely recommend checking that out, just because sometimes memory can be faulty, and sometimes the birth certificate will have it slightly more exact than it is in people's memories. And sometimes that can actually make a big difference. So for you, for example, let's just take a look at your chart. All right, so here's your chart. Using the time you gave me, which is just 6:30 p.m., the ascendant is located at 26 Aries, and the descendant is located at 26 Libra, while the sun is at 19 Libra. So the sun is basically a full 6 or 7 degrees below the descendant, having set just a little bit before you were born. Actually, let me animate the chart, because then we can actually see how early or how long before you were born it actually set. So I'm gonna go back here in Solar Fire, animate the chart, and share it again. There we go. Okay, so this is the chart for 6:30. If we back it up using the animate feature by just a few minutes, it looks like the sun hit the descendant or set at about 6:13, 6:14, 6:15. So you're only a quarter of an hour away from, or about 15 minutes away, using the 6:30 birth time from when sunset was. So that's already a little bit problematic, because it could go either way, since we know that if your parents' memory was off and it was 15 minutes earlier, then the sun could have been just barely above the descendant. So already I would want to apply some rectification techniques to this chart to start asking you some questions to try to get a sense of whether it's a day chart or it's behaving like a night chart. But that being said, to answer your initial question, if we just assumed that this birth time was correct and the sun was just barely about 6 or 7 degrees below the descendant, what I've been noticing over the past few years, so I used to take more of a hardline approach to this, and I used to think that as soon as the sun hits the ascendant, then sunrise occurs, and that's when day begins. And as soon as the sun hits the descendant, that's when sunset occurs, and therefore that's when night begins. But in reality, if you actually go outside and watch a sunrise or a sunset, you realize that there's actually a gray area there that lasts for quite a while, where before the sun has actually hit the ascendant, when it's rising in the morning, it starts getting very bright out long before the sun actually hits the ascendant. And similarly, even though the sun sets at the descendant, it takes a little while after that, sometimes before it's fully nighttime, before it's fully dark out. So there's a little bit of ambiguity or nuance in terms of figuring out when exactly does it become fully a day chart or a night chart. And what I've been finding over the past few years is that, especially when the sun is rising over the ascendant in the morning, that if it's even just a few degrees below the degree of the ascendant, that it will still behave like a day chart. So I've been using a rule that if it's anywhere up to 5 or sometimes even 6 degrees below the ascendant, that in some instances those charts do seem to be behaving more like day charts, to the point that that's almost become a rule, although it's something that I'm still researching and still trying to get a sense of. With the descendant, though, it's a little bit more ambiguous, and I feel like the range is a little bit tighter for that, where so far from what I've seen, I wouldn't necessarily go as far, or I'm still trying to pin down the exact range, but I've seen some where it's only a degree or two below the descendant and it's still acting like a day chart, and I've seen others where it's maybe a few degrees more than that and it's clearly already acting like a night chart. So with yours, we have the added ambiguity of there could be your birth time could be off. Like you could be born 10 minutes earlier, I think is what you said. And if we backed it up 10 minutes earlier, then we end up in that range, so that the descendant's at about 22 degrees of Libra and the sun is at 19 degrees of Libra. So they're only 3 degrees apart, and therefore you could hypothetically be in that range where it could still be acting like a day chart, even though the sun is just barely set. So normally what I would do, if this was like an astrological consultation, is I would actually start asking you some questions about different placements in your chart, especially the benefics and the malefics. And I would try to figure out if you respond especially more strongly to Saturn being a challenging placement in your chart, which would be more typical if you had a night chart. Or I would try to see if you were responding more to Mars being a more challenging placement in your chart, and the transits of Mars being more challenging, which would be more typical if you had a day chart. So because we're not talking necessarily live here right now, it's just sort of a chat thing, I can't necessarily go through all of that like I would usually do if you're a client or we're sitting in a consulting session or something like that. But I would just recommend that you go through that process yourself and see if historically in the past, in the few decades that you've been alive, if typically you've responded more negatively to Saturn transits, or if typically you've responded more negatively to Mars transits. And if you find that Saturn keeps sticking out as being much more problematic for you, then there's a pretty good chance that you're a night chart. Whereas if Mars tends to stand out as more problematic in terms of your history so far, then you'll probably find that it has a day chart, that you have a day chart. So, okay. So I think that was a good first question to start off with. So for those of you who are joining me, I'm testing out the live stream feature and the live stream feature on YouTube. And I'm tomorrow, Kelly Surtees and I are going to take questions from the audience. We're going to do something like this, and we're going to take questions from people and we're going to put their charts up and then talk about them. So right now I'm testing that out just to make sure that this works before we actually set it up tomorrow with Kelly. And I'm also trying to do a little bit of a test run by asking people for questions and starting to solicit questions from people tonight. So if you have a question that you want to submit for me and Kelly tomorrow, then send me an email with that question and your birth data and just a very brief synopsis of your question, just like a paragraph or two. If it's any longer than that, then we won't be able to take it. Otherwise, if anybody has any questions tonight while I'm testing this out, then that would be great as well. So just type them in the chat box in YouTube, and then maybe I can throw up the chart and answer them. So let me see if there's any other good questions so far. So Krista Carlo asked a question. He says, what can I expect from Uranus's transit through Taurus? So he has an accurate birth time. So let me go ahead and add that in. Thanks for submitting the question, Christopher. All right, so his birth data is April 8th, 1984, 85, 1:40 a.m. So in Oakland, California. So part of my idea for doing this is I wanted to try, yeah, sorry, I got it at 1985. I wanted to try the live streaming feature because I feel like there's a lot of different, I don't know, groups or a lot of different people that are using live streaming successfully. And one of the ones I wanted to experiment with is reading charts this way, because I kind of have gotten away from doing consultations over the past few years as I've been focused on the podcast. But if there was a way that I could do podcast episodes where I take charts and answer questions and show off my approach to astrology while doing an episode of the podcast, then that would kind of be the best of both worlds. So here we go. I'm going to share Christopher's chart now, and his ascendant, just to confirm, your ascendant is 19 Capricorn, right? There's like a 20 or 30 second delay on the stream, so that's why there's some of these delays. Okay, so yes, he's confirmed. So that should be correct. So, okay, so let's do first things first, which is where would I start in terms of delineating this chart? So you've asked specifically about how the transit of Uranus is going to be relevant to you or might affect you in your life when it goes into that sign starting later next month in May. But I want to start, we have to get a few basics down first in order to get a sense for the general gist of the chart before we can build up to answering specific questions like that. So the first thing, of course, that I ask or that I look at anytime I pull up a chart and that any ancient astrologer would look at is, what is the sect of the chart? So is this a day chart or a night chart? So the sun is actually in the bottom half of the chart down here in Aries. So this is actually a night chart. So right away, we know two things, or we know a few things actually. First, that's going to help us to identify which planets are going to be more problematic and which planets are going to be a little bit easier. So generally speaking, people with night charts have more challenges with Saturn, and Mars tends to be more constructive. Whereas conversely, for the benefics, Venus will tend to be the most positive planet, and Jupiter will tend to be somewhat less positive or more moderate in the manifestation of its positive significations. So that becomes relevant here, of course, because when Uranus goes into Taurus in this instance, it's going to immediately start forming a conjunction with Mars, because one of the principles that I use from a traditional or a Hellenistic standpoint is that a transit begins as soon as a planet moves into the sign that it will eventually complete the exact aspect in. So basically, as soon as Uranus goes into Taurus, by transiting Uranus goes into Taurus on, May 15th, that will start building up to the conjunction of transiting Uranus to your natal Mars at 17 degrees of Taurus. So that's one of the main transits that you're going to get during the course of that, especially early on. There's other ones, of course. I mean, you're going to get Uranus squaring Jupiter, Jupiter being in your second house. You're going to get Uranus hitting your IC, conjoining your IC and opposing your MC. The very first transit you're going to get is Uranus opposite Pluto. And then eventually towards the end of the transit, you'll get Uranus opposing your natal Saturn and your moon. And that's actually probably the most crucial. Well, I don't want to overhype that because the conjoining the IC and the Mars is also crucial, but the fact that Saturn is the ruler of your ascendant and the moon is your sect-light means that that conjunction at 27 and 29 Scorpio is very important and is very much a focal point of your chart in terms of setting or sort of dictating the direction of your life, because Saturn is the ruler of the ascendant. So when Uranus eventually catches up to those two and opposes them, that's probably going to be the most important part of that transit. So I guess one of the things we should start with then is just my keywords for Uranus, which tend to be unexpected disruptions. So that's usually my primary keyword, and that can kind of go either way, because sometimes an unexpected disruption can be positive and other times an unexpected disruption can be negative. So that whether it's going to go in a positive or negative sense basically partially just depends on what planets are involved and how it's hitting the chart. But unexpected disruption seems to be a really good keyword that covers a wide range of different potential Uranian significations. One of the major changes, and one of the things that I advocate people paying attention to, is ingresses when a planet goes into a new whole sign house. So for you, of course, Uranus's ingress into Taurus is going to move into your fifth whole sign house, which traditionally is the place of children. So one of the potential topics that we could see coming into play is some sort of unexpected disruption in the sphere of children. So sometimes when Uranus activates children placements for a person's children, that can mean a person who doesn't have children or doesn't want children suddenly finds themselves with children. Other times it can mean if the person already has children, there's something that the child does, or there's something that happens in the child's life that ends up representing a unexpected disruption for the native. So I've seen people who end up having a child who like goes through a major Uranus transit at that time and becomes very rebellious or something like that. So that's one sphere of your life that it's obviously bringing things into, is the fifth house. The natal IC is also there though. So I would have expected, as Uranus was transiting through Aries over the course of the past 7 or 8 years and going through your fourth whole sign house and conjoining all of those planets, that there would have been some unexpected changes and disruptions with respect to the home and the living situation and potentially the parents, which are all fourth house significations. But you'll actually probably see a continuation of some of those themes because your natal IC actually falls in the fifth whole sign house. And what that does is it imports fourth house significations over into the fifth house so that you get a doubling up of the two. So a continuation, to whatever extent you've had some themes having to do with changes in your home and living situation, continues as Uranus transits into Taurus, and then eventually culminates or kind of peaks once it hits your IC at 11 degrees of Taurus, which I guess will be probably a few years from now, whenever that is. I don't have an ephemeris on me at the moment. That opposition or that conjunction to your IC and the potential for destabilization of the home and living situation. Also, of course, it will be opposing the midheaven at the same time, which can create unexpected tensions and disruptions with respect to one's career and one's social status and reputation. So again, sometimes that's one of the annoying things about Uranus, is that because it's literally defined as the unexpected, you can't necessarily say which specific manifestation it will be and whether it's going to be a more positive one or a more negative one. But you can say that there's a pretty good chance for an unexpected and radical departure from the norm when you get a transit like that. So in your case, it will be happening in the career sphere. And because your MC is in Scorpio in the 11th whole sign house, we would expect there to be some overlap between 10th house significations having to do with career and 11th house significations having to do with friends and groups or social movements or other sort of 11th house things like that. So let's see. So that's going to be happening at the same time that you have Jupiter being squared at the same time. Jupiter's in the second house of finances, which normally would be a positive placement financially, although it's a night chart, so Jupiter is not quite as positive as it could be. It's also getting a superior square from Saturn, which would normally be a more negative financial indication, although it's mitigated by reception because Jupiter is in the domicile of Saturn in Aquarius, which takes some of the edge off of that square. And Jupiter, it looks like, is also being bona fide through a sextile from Venus, which is being cast from 11 degrees of Aries backwards in the order of signs and is within 3 degrees of Jupiter. So you've got some contrasting indications there in terms of Jupiter in the second and the potential for sort of positive financial things as a result of that placement, where there's some very challenging things hitting it and some very positive things counterbalancing it. But with Uranus hitting the IC and also squaring Jupiter in the second at the same time, you could probably expect that whatever the unexpected disruption is that hits the IC and opposes the MC, affecting both home and career, that's somehow causing a sort of unexpected disruption in terms of your financial situation at the same time with Jupiter in the second house. So I could kind of see that going either way, and I wouldn't want to go too far out on a limb here, not having talked to you about your previous history with that placement, in saying whether it was going to be like a negative disruption of your finances or a positive disruption if you're thrown into a different career where suddenly your earning potential changes radically. But that seems to be the sort of sphere that those early transits are very much focused on. So some of that is just reemphasized by Mars and Mars's rulership of the 4th house and the 11th house. So eventually Uranus will conjoin Mars, and you'll get a transiting Uranus conjoining Mars transit, but Mars is ruling the 4th house and the 11th. So again, it's just bringing sort of a repetition of similar themes into that of the home and the living situation and friends or potentially groups, as well as career, since the degree of the MC is in Scorpio, and therefore Mars is ruling the MC as well. So eventually, once you get past the middle part of that transit, Uranus will get to 27 and 29 Scorpio, opposing Saturn and opposing the moon. For that, I would primarily look to the rulerships of those two planets. So the fact that Saturn rules the ascendant, and the ascendant, I think, as you know, is traditionally referred to as the helm, like the steering wheel of the ship. The ruler of the ascendant, the planet that rules the ascendant, was traditionally thought to set a course and sort of navigate the native's life in a specific direction. So with Uranus opposing Saturn, it kind of implies that there's something about your overall life direction that suddenly gets disrupted or gets changed in a radical way at this point. And because it's an opposition, we would expect this to be a somewhat tense period in terms of making a departure from whatever your direction and sort of trajectory had been up to that point, and then suddenly moving in a different direction. Because Uranus shortly after that will oppose the moon, and the moon is ruling the 7th house in your chart, we would expect at that point that whatever the career and sort of life direction changes are that you go through at that point also end up affecting and leading to some radical changes in terms of your and unexpected changes in terms of your relationships. So those are some of the major themes that I would expect coming up at that point. There's probably other things that we could go into, and if we were sort of normally doing a normal consultation, I would probably ask you some questions about some of those placements in order to refine sort of which of those significations has tended to come out more in the past, or which of those planets you've tended to do well with or not do so well with in the past. And then we would try to narrow that down a little bit more through the sort of process of dialogue that the astrologer and the client usually goes through in order to sort of negotiate some understanding of what the chart means. But for the purpose of this, since we can't necessarily have that dialogue, that might be good for now. Next time, it might be good actually to have people. I mean, you don't have a webcam or something, do you, Christopher? Let me see what other questions have come through. So for some of these questions, I can only accept ones where you have an exact birth time, just because some of the techniques that I use are so dependent on that if you have like a rounded time, if it's rounded to the nearest hour. Yeah, let me, Christopher, I'll send you a link to join me in Zoom, and then maybe we could continue talking about some of these placements. So let me figure out how to do that. Okay, so Christopher, I'm going to email you the link to join me on the Zoom sort of live stream. Let me know. Yeah, basically just sign in whenever you get it, and then you can join me and we could talk about some of these placements further. Let's see. In the meantime, let's see other questions. So Arian from earlier is asking if there's specific questions you could ask about the rectification. I'll see if I can come back to that a little bit later. Richard, that's a good question. We'll see if we can come back to that one later as well, after I'm done going over this chart here pretty soon. All right. So, and anybody else who's just coming in, so this is a test where I'm doing a live stream where I wanted to try experimenting with reading charts as a group and just demonstrating my approach to reading charts using this live stream feature. I've kind of gotten away from reading charts over the past few years, past year or two, basically, because I've been doing the podcast so much with 4 episodes a month. And I wanted to try to find a way to get back to it. And I think the way to get back to it is maybe doing group delineations where I demonstrate how to interpret certain charts, while at the same time recording a podcast episode. Hey, how's it going? All right, I'm gonna unmute your mic. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me today, and thanks for submitting that question.
Oh, no problem. Thanks for, it's an honor to be on the YouTube with you.
Yeah, this is a bit of an experiment, but let's jump into it. So we already spent a little bit of time talking about your chart and some of those placements. Did you have any questions or like feedback about anything that's been said so far?
Yeah, sure. So, well, you talked a little bit about Uranus's transit through, like, the 4th house, I think, with Aries, and just to kind of give you an idea of what that was like for me. Some things related to the home and parents included that I pretty much moved into a house on my own. It's actually my parents' house, but I just rent it from them, and it's a very good deal. And eventually they're going to give it to me. And also my dad passed away during Uranus's transit through the 4th house.
Okay, so you had both of those things then, in terms of those two. It's like those are usually the two main sides of the 4th house. It's usually either your home and living situation or it's your parents. But in both instances that you had with Uranus going through there, you had some pretty major changes in terms of that area of your life.
Yeah.
Okay. And do you know when, like, I don't know, like, was some of that happening closer to when some of those exact aspects to those placements were taking place, where you have Mercury and Venus and the Sun there, or was it at the very beginning or very end of that transit, or how long ago was that?
Well, I think that with Uranus's ingress into Aries is probably about the time when I got the house to myself, and not long after that, I'm not exactly sure when, is when my dad started having health problems. He passed away December 1st in 2015, and I'm not quite sure where Uranus was then. So actually, I don't actually know off the top of my head where, if it was during a specific aspect to those planets.
Yeah, that actually would have been around that time. Let me actually animate that really quickly, because that might, we might be able to see that in terms of, so here is, let me share really quickly a bi-wheel that has the transits. There we go. So you said it was December of 2015?
Yes, December 1st.
Yeah, it looks like it was, so transiting Uranus was all over some of that stuff at the time. It was retrograding at about 16 Aries, so it was conjoining your natal sun in the fourth whole sign house, and then it looks like transiting Mars came up and started opposing some of those things at the same time. So yeah, so I guess you get both of those. So one of the things I would say, or one of the things that I just notice in terms of the future, is just that when people have the IC in a sign other than the fourth whole sign house, that you'll tend to see, like in your instance, because the IC is in the next sign after the fourth whole sign house, that you'll see a continuation of some themes having to do with the fourth house and the home and living situation, or the parents, as a sort of continuation of what happened when it went through the fourth whole sign house. Versus if somebody has the IC in like the third house, then you see that acting as an early precursor, so that you get a continuation through the third house and the fourth house. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. But that'll be part of it, just in terms of that Uranus transit.
Yeah, and then I guess it does kind of make sense to me that there could be some career things coming up for me, because, I mean, I know with Uranus it's supposed to be about surprising things or whatever, but in the next year I'm finishing up some classes, then I'm hoping to start a program that's going to advance my career in spring of, I guess it'd be, what would that be? Just not next year, but the following spring. So 2019, 2020, I guess that'd be then.
Spring of 2020. Okay.
Yeah, so I'd be starting a new program that hopefully that's my career, and that'd be a year-long program. And then I'll make more money if I get through the program, which maybe that is the second house thing. But I don't really know if, that'll go to plan. I know with Uranus is supposed to be about disruptions and surprises, right? So we'll see.
Yeah, one of the things is that you just, one of the things that's really good if you have some major Uranus transits coming up is just to be okay sometimes staying a little bit flexible in that area of your life, especially if you've kind of identified the area of the life that it might be pertaining to, and you can kind of anticipate that you might need to have greater flexibility there. Then sometimes those transits will hit you a little bit not as hard, or you'll be a little bit quicker on your feet in terms of adapting to it when necessary. If things do, basically, if an opportunity does arise, or if things do start heading in a different direction, just being prepared to go with that rather than trying to fight it or something like that.
For sure, that makes sense.
Sure. All right. And in terms of trying to think of other questions that I had, did you have any other questions in terms of anything else that was said previously?
No, I think it's pretty straightforward. I mean, I guess I'm just a little nervous about Uranus going through transit, just because I have all those like placements there in Taurus and Scorpio, but I think it'll be okay.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it can be very unexpected and take you in a new direction, but oftentimes I've seen that work out in a positive way just as many times as I've seen it work out in a negative way in terms of, Uranus, for example, hit my ascendant or conjoined my ascendant at the time when I started studying astrology. So that was a major change and a major shift in my life, and really reoriented and kind of destroyed whatever direction I'd been going on up to that point. But it ended up being, although chaotic at the time, sort of coming out of it in a positive way. And I see that happen just as often as the sort of unexpected, difficulties or horror story type scenarios. So it doesn't necessarily have to go in that direction.
For sure.
Cool.
Well,
All
thanks
right.
a lot.
Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing your question, for joining me on the experimental maiden voyage of this.
No problem.
All right, cool. Well, I'm going to switch over to another and take another question. And actually, if you want to stay on this with me, I mean,
Okay.
if you want to, or you can close it. This is just a test that I'm doing on the fly. So I'm just going to comment on another chart, but enough about astrology at this point that you could probably make some comments about the next chart that I'm about to look at as well.
Oh, okay. Sure.
Okay. All right. So let me switch over. So Richard Burns had a question where he's asking about his Uranus transit in the 8th house. Do you have he asked, should I look to regeneration? Do you have a more specific question that you have about that, or in terms of what you're concerned about? Let me enter the data really quick. So December 9th, 1953 at 1:50 a.m. in Toronto. Do you have a webcam, Richard? It's like a 20 or 30-second delay, but that might be worth asking at this stage. So let me pull up your chart. So does your chart have 8 degrees of Libra rising? Okay. So somehow I need to, I'm gonna post the link. I'm not sure if that's a good idea. I'm gonna post the link to this in the super chat, and then please just click the link and enter in your correct name, and then I'll sort of promote you to a panelist. Okay, so you have 8 degrees. So let me go ahead and make sure the chart is shared. The chart is up. So 8 degrees of Libra rising. So the first house is Libra. This is a night chart because the sun is in Sagittarius in the 3rd whole sign house. The ruler of the ascendant is Venus, which is also in Sagittarius in the 3rd house. Saturn is the malefic that's contrary to the sect, so that's the more challenging planet in the chart, in Scorpio in the 2nd house. The more constructive or positive malefic is Mars, which is in Libra in the 1st house, and Jupiter is the benefic that's contrary to the sect in the 9th house, attempting to do some positive things, but is not as benefic as it otherwise would like to be. So transiting Uranus has been going through your 7th whole sign house, which is the place of relationships and partnerships, for the past 7 years. It looks like for the most part that transit would have peaked pretty early on, at least in terms of its pertaining to relationships, because it would have hit the descendant at 8. Let's see if he's here. No. Okay. So it would have hit the descendant at 8. So there would have been a peak there, although it looks like there would have been another potential changing period of disruption for relationships when it opposed Mars, the ruler of the 7th, at 23 degrees of Libra as well. So maybe I spoke too soon about the entirety of that transit peaking early on. But certainly when it hit those 2 sensitive degrees of 8 degrees of Aries, hitting the descendant and then squaring the MC-IC axis at 9 Cancer and 9 Capricorn, that would have been a major period of disruption, presumably. Let me see. So is this you? Are you the one person SSRIC in the participant box? I'm not sure if you entered your name correctly. All right, so we'll skip that while I'm waiting for the question. So the question is basically what to anticipate from Uranus going into the 8th whole sign house. One of the ways that I would approach this question is the same way that I did in the previous one, which is basically looking at, because you can't always just rely on the whole sign house and the significations associated with it to be the primary thing that comes up, especially for an outer planet transit, because the outer planets are going to be going through the same houses for everybody, especially when you're using whole sign houses. So what you have to focus on then is especially what are the natal planets that are going to be hit when it's transiting through that sign. And the primary ones that I'm looking at in this instance are that Saturn placement that's in Scorpio in the 2nd whole sign house, and the Mercury placement at 28 Scorpio, which is also in the 2nd whole sign house. So the Saturn one is the big one, partially because this is a night chart, so Saturn is contrary to the sect. So we would expect that Saturn placement has probably coincided with some of your greatest hardships and some of your greatest difficulties, or at least the part of your life that you've probably struggled with the most to some extent, as a result of it being Saturn in a night chart in the 2nd house. Because it's in the 2nd house, the primary thing that probably pertains to is financial matters and possessions. And that's one of the primary things that I would expect to get hit, or that we would expect some disruption in once Uranus goes into the 8th whole sign house. So the 2nd house is the place of, your personal finances and your money, basically, or sometimes possessions, whereas the 8th house is this sort of the second from the 7th, and therefore signifies that which belongs to others, or that which has financial or material value to others. So the 8th house is interesting in that way, because sometimes that can directly mean financial matters or money that belongs to your partner or somebody that you're closely partnered with. Other times it can mean broader themes having to do with debt, or with money owed to other people, or money that is somehow wrapped up in other people. I've seen a sort of hilarious number of accountants who have career placements in the 8th house, partially because they deal on a day-to-day basis with other people's money. So Uranus going into your 8th house and then immediately opposing that Saturn placement, I would probably interpret as primarily having to do with some sort of financial shift and some sort of unexpected development or disruption in terms of financial matters pertaining to that 2nd house, 8th house axis. So one of the questions, if you were here, or if we were talking directly, is I would try and get to the heart of right away, especially since you recently, a few years ago, completed your 2nd Saturn return. I would really try to get a sense of what happened at both of your Saturn returns, first between the ages of 27 and 30, and then again more recently between while you were in your late 50s, how that Saturn placement has manifested, and in what ways it has gotten easier and in what ways it's gotten harder, or whichever way it went with that, because that's really one of the primary things that's going to get activated, and that's probably going to stand out as soon as Uranus makes that ingress in a couple of weeks here. So let me see if he's here yet. What do you think? Since you're my temporary co-host, Christopher, what do you think about that placement? Or have you ever met or known anybody with Saturn in the 2nd house in a night chart before? Or is there anything that sort of stands out to you in terms of that?
No, I haven't met anyone with that placement. one of the things I was just kind of looking at when I was looking at the chart was just that T-square with Mars and Neptune and the Moon and the North Node and Uranus. I was wondering maybe if that what it might be like when Uranus gets to around like 20 degrees, 22 degrees or so in Taurus.
Sure. In terms of like sextiling and trining the Moon Uranus opposition.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would definitely be one of the more positive sort of transits that he's going to have when Uranus goes into Taurus, because that's actually a good point, because he just came out of, the square of that, which is one of the things I was mentioning earlier. When Uranus opposed his natal Mars, it also would have been squaring. I think okay, he's here, but he's having problems getting the video and audio working. Let me try promoting him to a panelist. So go ahead and try now, Richard. So anyways, so that was a good point, because while I was focusing on Uranus opposing his Mars, you correctly noticed that that's tied into a T-square. So that he's coming out of a major transit of Uranus hitting that whole T-square through hard aspects. And then when it gets to 22 or the same degrees of Taurus, it'll be hitting them through much more positive ones. So yeah, that probably is one of the more, if not the most positive transit that he'll have as Uranus is going through Taurus later on. What is that? Probably like 5 or 6 years from now.
Let's see.
Yeah. Do you have an ephemeris?
In the other room, I could grab it.
No, it's okay. I'm trying to anticipate now, just by doing this and the process of trying it out. I'm getting a sense for like what things we need or what things I'll need in the future when Kelly and I do this tomorrow. So for those of you just joining us, this is an experiment. Tomorrow I'm going to be doing a live stream with Kelly, and we're going to be taking questions from the audience and then trying to answer them using the standard techniques that we both use in our practice. So if you want to submit a question, you can go ahead and do so in the chat box on YouTube tonight, or you can send me an email with your question and I will try to answer it tomorrow. So, hey, Richard, how's it going?
I've got the audio and video going, I think. Can you hear that?
Yeah, excellent. I can hear you just fine.
Okay, good.
All right. So, yeah, did you hear the discussion up to this point?
Yes, I was kind of divided mind because I was trying to get this video working, but I heard part of it.
Sure. So, I mean, my primary point was just, the main transit that you're going to have, or the main shift that I can see that would be unique to your chart versus, anybody else with Libra rising and Taurus as the 8th whole sign house, is just that it will form that opposition with Saturn pretty immediately after ingressing into Taurus. So I would anticipate that a decent part of the transit will have to do with financial matters. And I was curious then to what extent, I mean, that Saturn placement is tied into other topics in your chart. It's also tied into, it's the ruler of the 4th house, so it'd have to do with your home and living situation, and it's your 5th house, so it could potentially have to do with children. But my primary question, I guess, is to what extent has that Saturn placement in the 2nd house dealt with financial matters or sort of related questions in your life up to this point?
I think my first Saturn return, it might have been a positive financial thing. I had accumulated quite a bit of money in the first, or following the first one. I made a move into a lucrative situation, which allowed me to go and do some studies. And it was quite a tumultuous transit. The second one, it went by, the more recent one, and I wasn't even aware of anything. I was wondering whether I'd kind of squandered that transit opportunity.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've heard that a lot, that the second Saturn return tends to be a lot easier or sometimes less notable than the first one. But were you saying that the positive financial windfall, it happened during your first Saturn return, or it happened immediately after your Saturn return?
Immediately after, and the finances that I accumulated during that period allowed me to make a transformation into another career in that. And I'm wondering whether something like that might be happening now again.
Okay, sure.
Or whether there's going to be some kind of upheaval in our family house and financial situation in that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we're just talking about the Uranus transit and we're just talking about Saturn, because one of the sort of drawbacks, of course, of doing this on the fly is that normally if we were talking about broader career periods, I would pull up, for example, your zodiac releasing periods using the Hellenistic Time Lord technique, zodiac releasing, and I would see what chapters of your life you were in back during your first Saturn return, or what chapter of your life you're in now in terms of that. But if we're just talking in isolation about this, the one transit and the ingress of Uranus into Taurus and what you would expect to see from that, then, I mean, that's sort of the primary areas that I would expect to come into play would be those three areas that Saturn either rules or is placed in the chart, which is basically the financial sector, the home and living situation sector, and the children's sector.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I mean,
my
normally
son he just turned 16, so
okay.
he's still got a couple of years of high school and then university.
Okay, so I mean, by the time that is getting to that range, then, because since Uranus is just going in here in May, it'll take it 2 or 3 years maybe before it starts hitting the degrees of Saturn exactly. So he'll probably be going into adulthood at that point, or hitting the age of like 18 or whatever, and maybe leaving the house or going to school or something like that.
Yeah, and he's a sun in Taurus, so it'll be interesting to see how it affects him.
Okay, is it what degree of Taurus?
Let me see. Oh, I can't.
I mean, that's all right.
Yeah.
But that's actually a pretty common theme that astrologers, especially my friend Nick Dagan Best, remarks on pretty frequently, is that sometimes when a person is having a specific transit, there's another person in their life that has that placement as well natally, that somehow shows up prominently at that time in the person's life and kind of becomes the transit in some sense, or manifests the transit. So it's like if your son has the sun in Taurus and he's going through Uranus conjoining his sun while you're going through Uranus opposing your Saturn, that could be certainly tied into it.
Yeah, he's got sun at 8 degrees Taurus.
Okay, so yeah, he'll basically be having that transit around the same time.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely with Saturn's rulership of your 5th house, I could see children coming into play and that transit being tied in with that. Also probably something about your home and your living situation, or like in the previous chart that we looked at where it was tied into the 4th house, and the parents or family in some broader sense also becoming a major theme. Mm-hmm. So did none of those, I mean, because those would be the primary ones that I would ask about those 2 Saturn return periods in your late 20s and then your late 50s, and whether those topics came up. So the 3 topics are like finances, home and living situation / parents or children. Was none of that stuff relevant in any significant way during that recent Saturn return between what was the Saturn return dates? It was like 2012 through 2015.
Excuse me. It may have been. I'd have to really think back on it. We switched houses about 2 years ago, and I think we may have had to refinance at that time. So there could have been some constraint that was going on. Okay. That we emerged from.
So you might have refinanced as a result of some financial challenges that were coming up at the time or something like that?
I think we did have it around that time. I hadn't thought of that, but...
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that complicates transits like that, especially the Saturn return, is that it's usually it's usually not just specifically the house that the planet's transiting through, but it's usually like a combination of the house that it's in plus one of the topics, or sometimes two of the topics associated with the houses that it rules. So in your case, it's like Saturn in the second, but ruling the fourth and the fifth, and therefore oftentimes drawing those topics into play whenever Saturn gets activated.
I think I may have gotten back into investing in the stock market about that time too.
Okay, so you've done stock market trading?
Yes, I've been successful, not in a grand way, but I've always outperformed Standard and Poor. But I don't have a huge amount of capital, so it's more of a hobby.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's definitely, trading and stock markets, as well as accounting, which I mentioned earlier, are definitely eighth house type things. So if that's an area of your life where you've already had some positive developments, or that's something that's worked out well for you, then I could definitely see that being a factor that comes into play with Uranus transiting through your eighth house, especially when you start getting some of the more positive transits, like the one mentioned earlier, when transiting Uranus will sextile your natal Uranus in the 10th house when it gets to about 22 Taurus, and then it'll trine your natal moon in the fourth whole sign house. That could be like a positive financial windfall or development in terms of a Uranus transit. Although I'd probably be a little bit more cautious in terms of the opposition when it opposes Saturn at 5 degrees of Taurus to 5 Scorpio, just because of the potential for some volatility in terms of that, and the instability that a tense opposition can sometimes bring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think those are the primary things. You'll, of course, at the very, very end, you'll also get an opposition of transiting Uranus to natal Mercury. Let's see, with Mercury ruling the 9th and the 12th. Sometimes when Uranus hits the ruler of the 9th, it can be like a sudden change in terms of one's studies or focus. Other times I've seen people take a major trip or start interacting with like a foreign country or a group of foreigners who end up causing a sort of radical shift in terms of the native's life. So that's interesting for you. So the ruler of the 9th and the 2nd, I mean, sometimes that can mean like making money through teaching, or money through travel, or what's another one, like money through philosophy sometimes can be like a philosophy teacher or something like that. So it'll be interesting when Uranus opposes that, to what extent some of those significations come out.
Mm-hmm. When I was having the first Saturn transit, I was in a diplomatic service, and I was posted to Africa, where I was able to accumulate quite a bit of money.
Okay. How did you accumulate it?
Because it wasn't as expensive to live there. So I was able to live more frugally, although I was living more grandly too. But
Interesting. Okay.
yeah.
And that's an interesting thing as well, because I had a client who had Saturn in a night chart in the 2nd house, except it was ruling his ascendant. So it's much more prominent in his life, or it was more important. But that was a major theme for him in terms of living frugally, and his ability to do that as something that he sort of took it for granted. But when you asked other people, like his wife that knew him, she would say, that's something that he really excels at, or he's really good at being very frugal. Was that just a temporary thing at that time in your life, or is that a general theme that?
I think that was probably temporary. I'm accused more of being more of a spender than a saver.
Okay. So it was just during the period, was that during your Saturn return, or when was that?
I think I had been from probably 21 up past that period, and then I had to invest that money into education and that.
Okay. And then
I had various periods where I was more strained financially because of the education, the cost of education.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So there have been those interesting connections then between your 9th and your 2nd house in both sounds like it's manifested both ways. In one sense, in accumulating money as a result of living in a foreign country or working in a foreign country temporarily, but then secondarily losing money or major expenditures of money in the sphere or as a result of education.
Yes, I suppose, yeah.
How far did you go with your education to that it sort of drained you that much?
I always did my education part-time, so I was always working while I was doing it, except for the PhD level where I went and I had a scholarship. But then that took me out of the workforce, although I was teaching at university until I got back into it.
Okay.
The workforce, yeah.
But you did get a PhD?
Yes, yeah. And I have a social work degree as well.
Okay, so you have two separate degrees?
Yeah, and when I first went, I took a year off to study astrology, actually, after I came back from Africa. I went to Hawaii and I studied with someone who'd studied with Dane Ruger.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, he actually studied with Carl Jung too, but he never mentioned the astrological part of it.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Great. All right. Well, yeah, I mean, those are some of the sort of the main things that I'd focus on in terms of that Uranus transit. And probably just a repetition of some of those themes in your life coming up. I guess like with the previous advice, since we were also talking about a Uranus transit, one of the main pieces of advice is just staying flexible and being open to major, sometimes radical changes in direction, even if they aren't what you initially planned for. For you, I would primarily, at least in terms of the transit to Saturn, assume that was going to pertain to those three areas of financial matters, home and living situation, or children.
Okay.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for your question, and thanks for joining me for this experiment on the webcam and everything.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Chris. And,
yeah.
Yeah. And
all
Chris.
right.
Yeah.
Sure. Both Chris's.
Chris's, yeah.
Oh yeah. Do you have any comments, Christopher, after some of that?
No, I should probably leave it for the expert.
Okay, no problem.
And I actually got to get going, but thanks for having me on here and for looking at my chart. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for joining me.
All right. Bye.
Bye. All right. Hey, and Tony Mack, thanks for doing that. So Tony Mack is a longtime supporter who just donated $7. So that was part of why I wanted to test this, is because in doing the YouTube live stream, one of the things that you can do is people can donate like certain amounts by clicking the little, I think there's like a dollar sign below the chat box. So Tony just donated $7 and says, I'm often looking for interesting live content while working, and this is perfect. So thanks a lot. I appreciate it. What I may do in the future, so this is an experiment right now where I'm taking questions from the audience. If people have a question about their birth chart, and then I'm throwing the chart up to display it, and then I'm talking about how I would approach answering that question. And then sometimes if a person has a webcam, I'll bring them on at the same time. So part of the reason I'm doing that is because I want to test out, I've sort of gotten away from doing consultations because I've been focusing on doing 4 to 6 episodes of the podcast every month, and therefore that's become almost my full-time job. But if there's a way where I could do a podcast episode where I read charts from the audience, then that would be a great way to sort of get back to doing chart work and combining those two things. So one of the things that I might do in the future is that people can ask a question if they donate like a certain amount in the chat box or something like that. But for the purposes of tonight, I'm just going to be taking a few more questions for free, and we'll see how it goes. All right. So one person had a question a few times, but I can't take your question just because your birth time is rounded at 3 a.m. And so as a result of that, I need the birth time to be precise, because otherwise if something's off, I could give you an answer that's not accurate for your chart. So you could still email me that question, and I can pull up the chart later and maybe we could answer it in the show I'm going to do with Kelly Surtees tomorrow. But for the purposes of tonight, I just want to do some quick and easy questions where I know for sure that the chart is accurate, that the birth time is accurate. So Athena has a question about Uranus going through her natal 6th house. So I'll go ahead. Do you have a webcam, Athena? Let me enter the chart data. Yeah, you do. Okay. So here's the link. I'm going to put the link for you to join me in the chat box right there. So go ahead and click that and then enter your name, and then you'll be able to join me in Zoom and in the live stream. So in the meantime, let me go ahead and share Athena's chart. All right. So let's see, while we're waiting for her to join us, just to reiterate, I'm taking some questions. If anybody has a question, I don't know if I'm going to keep doing this for too much longer because I've already been at it for over an hour, but if you have a question, just post it in the chat box here on YouTube. It looks like there may be a separate thread going on Facebook, but I'm only really paying attention to the YouTube chat right now. So if anybody has a question, basically post your birth data. You have to have an exact birth time, but post your birth data in a short paragraph, a concise paragraph with your question. And then if I have time, I'll throw it up. Otherwise, tomorrow I'm going to be doing a show like this with Kelly Surtees, I think at about 1 o'clock Denver time, and we'll be taking some more questions. Okay, and I'm going to, just so this is correct, I'm going to go ahead and remove yours right now. Just so this is correct, I'm going to go. Hey, how's it going?
Hi.
Do you have any headphones?
Yeah, I'm just trying to find them. Hold on 1 second. I'm so sorry.
Sure. Hey, how's it going? Okay, just a second. We're getting set up. So if anyone has any questions, just post them in the chat box. Here, I'll write my email address. So I'm putting my email address in the chat box for anybody that wants to email me a question for tomorrow's discussion. Just send it with your birth data and with a brief description of your question that's not too long. All right, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, this is a bit of an experiment, but we'll see how it goes. So this is your chart. Do you have 8 degrees of Sagittarius rising?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And what was your question?
I was looking at how the Uranus transit's going to affect me because it's moving. Oh, it was going over my, that Uranus is going over my North Node, and there's a lot I'm experiencing, like a lot of 5th house themes right now. And I just want to look at like what that next like block of time is gonna do, like as the Uranus transits, because I also have Uranus in the 1st house, and I'm kind of associate a lot with Uranus as a person, and I think a lot of people see a lot of that in me. So I feel like the transit, I just want to get some textures on that as it moves houses.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah, and that's a pretty big shift just because you have so many cardinal placements already natally that Uranus would have been squaring a lot of those over the past 7 years.
Yeah.
Whereas once it moves into Taurus, you're not getting as many hard aspects as you were over the course of the past decade, but instead it's largely a bunch of trines and sextiles to the same placements. So that's actually the good news, is that it looks a lot smoother this next 7-year stretch, at least in terms of as far as Uranus is concerned,
Yeah.
compared to the some of the changes and stuff I would have expected from the last 7 years.
Yeah, I had the last 7 years were pretty crazy for me. I'm an actor and I was like living between two countries, and everything has been focused around sort of like it's like everything's been about self-expression and creativity, and like having work that feels like a child. Like all this fifth house stuff has been like that belonged to me, and I'm so attached to so much of the work, and it's so personal.
Sure.
But I think like I'm feeling like I'm starting to settle into my career. Like I have a different agent now, and things are changing a little differently, where I'm approaching the daily work of this quite a bit differently. So it's interesting because to me, it's like the sixth house theme is like with Uranus going to start making all those trines, is like it's like a healthier approach. It feels like almost like the daily work of it feels a lot more grounded and comfortable. Like I can actually get some kind of benefit and reward rather than the kind of roller coaster of like wild self-expression that's been like ripping through.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Especially, lately, the past year or two, Uranus would have been squaring exactly that opposition between Mercury at 27 degrees of Cancer and the Moon at 27 Capricorn, as well as Mars at 21 Capricorn, with Mercury ruling your midheaven in your 10th house, and therefore being directly tied into career matters. So, I mean, one of the major shifts, of course, going into your sixth house, which would be true for most people having it go into their sixth house, is that usually it tends to highlight two areas. One of them is work and the general things that you do for a job or that you do partially to survive, which is also kind of like a second house topic. But then also secondarily, health matters, and just matters pertaining to your physical body and like what it takes to keep it going and to stay and maintain good health. So those are the two primary areas that I would expect to come up in terms of that transit, just in general. If we're talking about the entirety of what'll be most of the next decade for you, of Uranus transiting through Taurus, is that transit primarily relating to changes, sometimes unexpected changes pertaining to work matters, and other times pertaining to health matters or just bodily matters and things that you do in terms of your sort of bodily regimen.
Yeah.
So, I mean, usually I would go through, if we were doing like a full consultation, I would probably go through other like past history in terms of how those things have worked out for you in the past. So, for example, having Saturn on your ascendant and Uranus on your ascendant, I would be curious if those have primarily come up in terms of relating to your character and your personality, or if those have ever come up in terms of like bodily matters or health issues that you've had in the past. Like if you've had any specific or unique health issues or things that are unique to you in terms of your health and physical regimen that kind of stand out.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because what marks me amongst my colleagues is self-discipline, and I think most people see me as this incredibly disciplined person. I grew up playing classical music and doing competitive gymnastics, so I have this baseline of like understanding how to discipline the body in a way that I feel some creative people need to. It takes them a lot longer to get there. But so it's like there's that Saturnian understanding in me, and I think also a lot of my performances and the characters that I play and the way that I present myself and have ended up presenting myself are very strange people and also outsiders. I play a lot of like figments of people's imagination. I play a lot of people who like may have an alien type quality and come in and like I'm sort of a wild card. Like my old agent would say that, oh, she's a wild card. She's a wild card. So in practice, there are such themes of Saturn in the way I approach my work. I'm like wildly serious, but the people I'm playing are kind of wild cards, and I enjoy identifying with them, even though I'm I'm dead serious inside.
Okay, brilliant. So you've got both the Saturn thing going on as well as the Uranus thing in terms of your first house and the way that that pertains to your sort of character and the way that you present yourself and come off to people.
Yeah, and I think it's been it's a struggle too, because I've there's been so much focus on like, how do we market you, and do we market the more contained, stricter side of you that's able to do these things, or is it more interesting or useful for the market to market you as somebody who's more of a wild card and wacky, and is there a place for that? And so actually the struggle between those two textures when it comes to identity has been complicated for me. I'm like, whoa, well, which one am I? And sort of accepting such extreme facets of self in the way others see me, and in my personality, because I'll get like opposite feedback at all times from people. So I navigate like I tend to polarize people. And so when I'm getting feedback from fellow professionals, it's like they've given me opposites. What do I do? And then at the end of the day, it's like, I guess I do whatever the hell I want. Like because like either one, right? So yeah, those two are really big. But I think a lot of the Saturn stuff is really highlighted because I have that Moon and Mars in Capricorn, and I think I feel that more than I feel the some of the electricity of Uranus. But then when that electricity of Uranus comes through my personality, I can shake things up. I'm a person who changes things when I come into a situation. So I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that thing of for mutable signs, especially, or people that have mutable signs on the angles, that notion of sometimes being a tension between doing one thing or another. But eventually, I find a lot of them coming to peace with eventually doing both, or finding a way to do both, rather than sort of thinking that it has to be all one way or another. And that often seems to be one of like the ultimate sort of lessons that people have with heavy mutable placements, depending on where that is in their chart, is learning to be comfortable sort of doing both or doing two things at once.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and I think I'm only starting to come to that time period of my life where I'm like, oh, I can be both, and both actually make it more interesting for me. And like not firmly fitting in a category gives, say, my performance or my approach to my work a lot more texture. And I can pull off layers. So that I'm more complicated if I try to simplify myself. It's like the message is not as clear if I iron it out too much.
Sure. Yeah. And you would have just completed a really crucial period of your life after the past 2 or 3 years with Saturn moving through Sagittarius and completing your first Saturn return. And that it would have been probably at its most intense when Saturn first went into Sagittarius during the early phases of that, since you would have had your exact Saturn return then. But it really would have still been ongoing and wouldn't have fully wrapped up until Saturn departed from Sagittarius just this past December. So I assume that was a large part of what you're trying to figure out during the course of that over the past 2 or 3 years as well.
Yeah, I mean, I did my master's degree overseas at the Bristol Old Vic in England. So I was out of the country. It was a lot of Sagittarius themes, and I had definitely a crisis of self, like, who am I? I had course mates. There were only 13 of us for a year in conservatoire, and it was amazing. Like everything that I was focused on during my master's and my training was sort of like, who am I? Which guy am I? And it broke me in some places. That Saturn return was really hard. It broke apart the partnership I was in. It broke apart a lot of things, and sort of like squeezed me. And a lot of the times it would be like, it was all about like, which person are you anymore, Athena? And it's sort of like, I don't know which person I am. I thought I had become comfortable with the way I was approaching my work, but I mean, drama school famously breaks you back down to build you back up again. So there's like a lot of Saturn themes there, because it's always about like getting to the core of the person and finding out who they are and giving them technique and then building them out and sending them out into the world. And it broke me pretty hard. And it was all about, because it wasn't going through a place where it was like, not, it was all about me, and suddenly everything was all about like the self, like, who's this one? I was like, that Saturn return happening in another country in Sagittarius, like which guy are you? And for years, actually, I didn't have my appropriate birth time. So even though I've studied astrology for a while, I didn't know that my Saturn return was happening in my first house.
Okay.
So in reflection, now that I have gotten the accurate birth time, it makes all the sense in the world that it would be the first house, because it was so self-focused, specifically on personality, specifically with, matters of marketing personality and stuff that just didn't digest well with me, that I had to, like, this is the way it was sort of like, this is the way it works. This is the structure of the industry. You have to deal with this. You have to figure out who are you and what we're going to sell. And I'm like,
Right. Yeah. I like that keyword that you used, crisis of the self. I think that's a great keyword for Saturn returns that happen in the first house, or even Saturn returns that happen when it's making a hard aspect to the ruler of the ascendant. I've seen that stand out as well, is this notion of the crisis of the self, and like, who am I and what do I stand for? But also sometimes like, how do I appear to people? How do I present myself? And how do I come off to people, as being like really common themes with that transit. So that's interesting that you went through that during that time, and that's just wrapped up for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, and in terms of the other Uranus transit, I mean, I'm not sure, just because it's not making hard aspects to your chart, it's not in a major prominent part of your chart in terms of this transit. I mean, I'm struggling to really point to anything that's necessarily going to be like a huge deal about it. Oh yeah, one thing I did want to mention though, actually really quickly, for the purpose of everybody watching, this is a really good example also of a day chart Saturn return, because you have your sun above the horizon in the top half of the chart up in the 8th house. So you have a day chart, and people with day charts tend to experience their Saturn return as being a little bit more constructive. And even though you went through some challenges and some struggles, and there was certainly some introspection and some serious themes that were going on, it wasn't necessarily like the end of the world, or you didn't have like your sense of selfhood was just like crushed or something like that.
Yeah.
It was
It
more
was done
constructive.
in like a really safe environment. I mean, I couldn't have been in a better place for that to happen, because like that's what they do at that school. Like that's what it's built for. So it was almost as if it happened like in a safe space where like I could actually, like, it was emotionally scary, but did I feel like something was terribly dangerous? No, like everyone was guiding me to come to this conclusion. So for as difficult as it was almost like I took Saturn's test kind of thing, and I came out with what I needed to take the next steps. Because I definitely felt when the transit was happening in December, that was because I came back to the States, and I actually took more coursework. Like I felt like I wasn't done sort of getting the perspective I needed, and I needed the perspective of an American teacher as well. Like I just needed an extra bit of education, and then that sort of wasn't finished until December of this year in New York. So it was like I stepped out into the new year like with a plan, and it's been a very useful plan for me in my career. And it was all centered around like, which person are we selling, and that was it, that I feel like that journey didn't end, and in some ways may never end, but I have the baseline now, but like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that sets a foundation basically for the next 30 years, where some of the themes that were laid sort of as seeds, or that you came to new realizations about at that time, will continue to grow and develop as you go through the next 28 years of your second Saturn cycle, basically. And then there'll be important turning points, especially when it hits the hard aspect, like when it goes into Pisces and it squares its natal position.
Yeah.
There'll be like the challenge to whatever it was that you initiated in terms of your understanding of yourself back at the Saturn return while it was going through Sagittarius. And then eventually you'll have the opposition, where you'll probably come into contact with another person or like a relationship that will then cause a sort of tension, as you then have to redefine yourself in terms of this other person or this partnership, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, so it's nice that you found that theme really early on. The only thing I would say about your original question, one of the shifts that happened after you completed your Saturn return is Saturn, of course, went into your second house. So that's a large part of the next 2 or 3 years is going to be that Saturn transit through your second house and either conjoining your Capricorn planets or opposing some of your Cancer planets. Yeah. And I feel like that's a good preview of, while that may bring some challenges or some setbacks or some instances where you have to do more with less, like you have less to work with, but you still need to find a way to do just as much with it. The Uranus transit going through Taurus is going to be a nice offsetting influence as it's trining and sextiling those placements, and therefore probably giving you the opportunity for having an innovative outlet in some way to some of the challenges that Saturn raises as it's going through your second house and going through Capricorn. So that's one of the things I would say just in terms of the Uranus transit is that potential for finding innovative solutions to issues that come up, especially ones that are pertaining to like work or financial matters specifically, just because we're talking about the second house and the sixth house.
Yeah.
That would probably be one of the main themes that I would focus on, especially in terms of not proactive, but constructive themes that you'll probably find with that Uranus transit.
Yeah, I feel that that's really apt. Like that's a really precise because I tend to, I don't think I've never had much to work with, and I've found that I've learned that innovation comes from extreme structure, and I've learned to see like lack as a creative player in my creation of my work, especially my filmmaking work. And it's almost like I write screenplays for what we have, not what I dream of. So I learned to do that. And I used to sort of dream bigger, but I've found that one of the best collaborators is restriction. So I'm actually feeling that already, where I shot a pilot that I wrote this year, but I wrote it completely based on like the locations we had access to. I like didn't want to spend anything. So I become really rather miserly, but like only to be like, let's get all of this crew in this area and see what we can do with it, because that's more impressive than actually raising all the money. And I've found that like in circumstances where things are really, really restricted is where like you get the best, like necessity, the mother of invention kind of thing has been like, it's been like kind of starting to come up in me, and I'm relentlessly positive, so I always spin lack with some innovation side of it, like but it's nice to know that Uranus going through the sixth will give a little bit of oomph to that, because I do feel really bare bones about a lot of what I'm doing right now, and it's just sort of like, all right, let's just go do it. It'll figure itself out. Like I tend to trust in the people and the talent more than I want to try to make anything lavish, you know?
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a really good manifestation of it. Also ruling like your second house and your third house, and just the way, like we saw in the last example, where sometimes what you have with a person's Saturn placement is just not just its placement in the house that it's in, but it's usually a combination of importing topics from the other two houses that it rules. In this case, financial matters, and importing that into the first house, and then potentially like writing or communication and importing that from the third house into the first.
Cool.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see then, just as Saturn transits through your second house first over the next 2 to 3 years, and emphasizing some of the financial side of that. And then finally the third house, and emphasizing the writing or communicative part of that a little bit more, how that continues to grow and develop.
Yeah. Cool.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for sharing your chart.
Thank you so much. Yeah. That's cool. This is a cool thing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining me in this experiment. It's a bit of an experiment, but hopefully.
I love experiments.
Right.
Experiments. I'm all about it. Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
All right. Well, let me see if there's any other questions. Stop sharing. Okay, so there's been a few other questions. So we're going on 2 hours, so I'm not sure how many other questions I can take right now, but let me just see what other ones we have right now. So first, thanks to SMOTV IDI for donating $5. I appreciate it. So that was one of the things that we were testing out, is just if doing a live stream with YouTube, if people can just make random donations, which is always nice and we appreciate it. I'm just taking questions for free, but in the future I might do a thing where people can like ask a question after donating like $5 or something like that. We'll see how that goes. So identifying career path might be a little bit much right now in terms of, that would be a pretty broad question, because we'd want to talk about a few placements in your chart and get a sense for like your trajectory. So that might be a little bit much to go into right now. Other questions. Ellen Campbell has a question asking, why didn't I stick with astrology as a career when I started studying it in the 1960s? I'm a chemist instead. That actually might be a good... Okay, thanks, Nicholas. So I am 2 hours in. So I'm going to do, I'll take that one because that's kind of an interesting one, because it's a more of a retrospective one. So, but first, Ellen, do you have a webcam so that I could actually talk to you? Yeah, and it's not that that was a bad question to ask a cult fan. There's lots of good ones. It's just more of a, I think I'm running out of energy tonight because I've been doing it for 2 hours. So I'm just trying to find an easy one, whereas yours might, I feel like that's one where we've probably take like 20 or 30 minutes to go through it properly. Okay. I mean, if you have so Ellen's testing out her webcam. A cult fan, if you have a webcam, if you do have a webcam, why don't we try it really quickly and we'll take a look at your chart and just see if there's any major one that stands out. So I'm going to put the link for both of you. So let's start with you, a cult fan. So click this link and make sure you enter your screen name the same as you have it here. And then I'll enter your chart data right now. And while Ellen's looking for her webcam. All right, so your birth data is September 22nd, 1984, 5:46 p.m. Massachusetts. Okay. All right. Did you get the link? Let me go ahead and share the chart here. Okay, you're on your phone. So what was your question again? So if you can't use the webcam, I'll just sort of do this really quickly. Okay, I'm starting up your computer now. And is the live stream still working for you guys? Because it looks like frozen for me for some reason. Okay. In your chart, you have 7 Pisces rising. Is that correct? It is working. Okay, good. 7 Pisces rising. So let's just do the basic things. So this is okay. Hey, welcome, SJ. Thanks for joining us. So this is September 22nd, 1984. This is a day chart. The sun is in the 8th whole sign house, so it's in the top half of the chart. Pisces is rising, and the ruler of the ascendant is Jupiter, which is placed in Capricorn in the 11th whole sign house, which is the place of friends and alliances and groups. Jupiter is also the ruler of the 10th house, as well as the midheaven. Just looking at the chat. Okay, so Jupiter is the ruler of the 10th house. So Jupiter is not just ruling the ascendant and therefore the helm of the chart. So it's not just directing the life towards a specific destination in terms of the native's focus and interests, but it's also ruling the 10th house of career and social standing and occupation. So it should have something specific to say about career matters as well. So that puts a lot of emphasis on Jupiter in this chart, for better or worse, just in terms of establishing the overall life direction and part of the focus of the life, or at least some of the major themes that should become dominant ones during the course of the life. Let's see, have you joined us? Just want to make sure I can't. Okay, so one of the things I would say then right away, just having the ruler of the ascendant and Jupiter, the ruler of the ascendant and the ruler of the 10th and the 11th house, is that I would say that if your life is not somehow directed towards working with groups and friends and alliances and social movements in some broader context, if that's not something that ends up being instrumental to you in terms of your career or in terms of the specific career path that you end up taking, then it may actually work out in a much more literal way, in that you literally end up working in a career that has to do with themes of friends and groups and allies and things of that nature. Okay, let me see if you're there. No, you're still in the process. Are you still setting up your webcam? Okay. So that's one of the things I would say, is just that career matters are focused on the 11th house. So any sort of career that has to do with like friends or groups or alliances would not only be something that would be, your life would be more directed towards, but would be actually beneficial. Because part of what's going on here is that Jupiter is the most positive planet in your chart because you have a day chart. So it's not just that it's sort of focused there because the ruler of the first and the ruler of the 10th is in the sector that has to do with friends, but you would expect that friends and alliances and groups would be the area of your life where you would have some of the most positive things, or some of the greatest benefits or windfalls would come to you from that area of your life, because you have Jupiter there in the 11th house, 11th whole sign house in a day chart. So we might be able to get some further specification on that by the condition and placement of the ruler of the 11th, which, since it's Capricorn on the 11th whole sign house, the ruler is Saturn, which is in Scorpio in the 9th house. So that brings in themes having to do with, there's a few different areas. One of them is like learning and education. Another one is religion and philosophy, like a person's beliefs. And then another area is travel and foreigners or foreign places. So somehow the 11th house themes having to do with friendship are being tied in with 9th house themes having to do with basically that which is foreign, or that which has to do with your belief and your overall philosophy of life. So in some instances in the past where I've seen combinations like this, it has to do with like the native being involved in groups of like-minded people, or people that have a similar philosophical or religious beliefs. So for example, I've seen one person who it was the reverse of this, where they had the ruler of the 9th and the 11th, but they eventually became involved in organizing an astrological group, and eventually became the president or like the leader of an organization for astrology. So in that instance, the combination of the ninth house and the 11th house ended up being very literal, where the person literally ended up working with people that had a similar interest in astrology. So that's obviously a very specific manifestation, but that sort of gives you some idea of the sort of lines that could go down in terms of, oh, there you are. Let me promote you to a panelist. And let me unmute your mic. Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a little bit low. Do you have any way to turn the gain up?
Oh, yeah. How we doing?
There. Perfect.
Okay.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for joining me, and thanks for sharing your chart and your question with me tonight.
Thank you. And hi, everyone in the chat room. I just wanted to make clear, I just actually recently became a Freemason. So like what you're saying is like,
Okay. Wow. Okay. So you literally recently just joined an organization or a group, you might say, of like-minded people that's partially religiously and philosophically based.
right. And it's really wonderful. It turns out I'm 33, so take that for what you will. I didn't know, and I have a mouth guard in, by the way. I hope I'm coming through clearly. I didn't know that my entire family pretty much was Freemasons until I became one. It was just, yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's pretty big. So how recent was that?
I was initiated in October. I was a second degree in February, and I was raised a Master Mason April 9th.
Okay. So what we're talking about partially here, because like the last chart, we have a thing going on where Saturn would have been going through your 10th house as that was happening, as you made that discovery over the past few years, over the past 2 to 3 years. Basically, you would have had Saturn transiting through your 10th whole sign house. And that's actually a little bit interesting because it would have squared your natal Mercury and it would have opposed your IC at the same time. So it's interesting that family component came into play in terms of you discovering that your family was into this, and it was something that you didn't know previously.
Yeah, that just happened very recently.
Okay. So Saturn has since departed from your 10th house, and currently it's going through your 11th whole sign house, and it's transiting over and recently stationed relatively close to that natal Jupiter placement that we're talking about here. So that could be the reason, or that could be the specific trigger for why, this is the sort of broader themes that I was just talking about actually becoming much more important now in the recent past, and you sort of achieving or climbing those levels recently as you have been.
I mean, there's that. I recently lost my employment like last week.
Okay.
All 3 malefics. That's not a 3. There we go. All 3 malefics. Well, if you count Pluto,
Mm-hmm.
I would. They were all in the 10th house that day, and there was I was walking dogs for my job, and in the 6th house was a Scorpio moon. So,
Okay.
I saw that as a really key important to the day that happened on. But that's why I'm wondering. I mean, if I was walking dogs, obviously that means I had no idea what I really wanted to do, right? It was just a rut job. No offense to those who love it, but for me, it's not. And I'm glad that I've parted ways with that because it's opened me up. It burned me, and now I'm rising from the ashes. That's why I'm asking this question, because I want to put myself, I don't have that much time of life left, but I would like to make sure that I spend it appropriately. That's why I'm asking this question.
Sure. Yeah, that's one of the issues that I sometimes run into when trying to delineate career matters. And that's one of the reasons why I initially shied away from this question, because, there's 3 areas that we look to for matters pertaining to one's career and livelihood. It's the 10th house for career and social standing and reputation. It's the 6th house for work, and it is sort of situations in which the native is in a subordinate role to others. And then there's finally the 2nd house, which is what you do in order to make money. And one of the issues is that sometimes these can be different things, or at different stages in a person's life. These are not necessarily the same thing. Sometimes the thing that a person is passionate about, or the thing that they become known for, or the thing that they associate with their career, their reputation, is not necessarily the thing that they do in order to make money. And sometimes that creates a little bit of an issue when delineating somebody's chart, because I've had issues in the past where you end up delineating the 10th house and focusing on the thing that the person is passionate about, that they want to become known for or do become known for, but it's not necessarily the thing that pays the bills. So that's one of the issues here, although it sounds like you're already headed in a specific direction, or that you're on the right track. And I think that you might find that with that placement of Jupiter being activated recently, and with you being pushed in that direction towards joining this group of like-minded individuals, you might find that that ends up being more relevant in some way to your overall career and life direction than it might have seemed at first. And I say that primarily because it's not just the ruler of the 10th, but it's also the ruler of the ascendant. So it's if it was just like the ruler of the ascendant, I would say this might just be something that you're focused on, but it doesn't necessarily become your career or something like that. But the fact that the ruler of your 10th is also Jupiter, and it's also that 11th house placement ruled by Saturn in the 9th, implies to me that there's something about groups and alliances and friends that's going to be more crucial to your career in the long run than it might be for somebody else.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, sorry. My mic is on. Hi.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. I guess like I've heard from people like I don't know if you've heard of Frederick Xavier. He does a quick and dirty way that says like, look to your Venus for what you love, look to your Mars for what motivates you. And I was just wondering if you would be able to look at my chart and see what kind of, like, I love my Alice. That's my guitar over here. But, you know, like you say, just because you love guitar doesn't necessarily mean Jimi Hendrix plus, you know, and just because you're Hendrix doesn't mean you get money.
Sure.
But I was just wondering, and I guess the origin of the question, to make it really clear, and I think you could see why I'm asking this, is like, and this is my Pisces rising totally like keeping me from having an idea of this thing, I think. But I'm wondering what it looks like I would be efficacious as to give back to the world, plus plus money.
What would be efficacious to give back to the world and would also be financially viable?
Like what? Yeah, based on what I look like. Like, I mean, you could look at it and say, well, this guy's definitely not a stock trader or something like that, you know. But like, I was hoping for something in that wheelhouse, which I don't know if that's like needle in the hay, or if there's something you could see in there, maybe communication wise. I think I'm pretty good at communicating, etc. But like, I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the two things that are really positive placements in your chart. I mean, you've got a few actually really positive placements in your chart. I mean, the Mercury placement is in pretty good condition, being in its own domicile in Virgo. It recently must have stationed direct, probably about 2 weeks before you were born. So it's moving direct. It's in Virgo, but it's in the 7th house. And so one of the issues with that is that might be something more that comes from either your family, since it rules the 4th house, since Gemini is on the cusp of the 4th, or comes from your partner, like specifically a relationship partner or perhaps a business partner, that you're not able to fully draw out unless or until you're working with another person. So that's a part of your chart that's definitely strong and is there in a prominent and positive way, but it's something that might not be fully unlocked sort of on your own necessarily.
Absolutely.
Sure. So
I sorry to interject. I'm always better when I have a partner.
Okay. Sure.
I think.
Yeah. Well, that's something then definitely to gravitate towards and to be open to, because sometimes there's people who they don't know if they should, you know, rely on that, or they don't know if they should sort of give themselves over to having to be, or can have nerves about being overly dependent on somebody. But in your case, it seems like that's a placement where once fully unlocked, it can be more of a beneficial or a complementary sort of part of your charter placement, rather than something that's more challenging or something to stay away from.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, please. I'm sorry.
So the only other thing is that we haven't touched on at all is just the cluster of Uranus and Mars and Neptune in your 10th house, which are all clustered around your midheaven. And this is a little challenging because what they're doing is those 3 placements or those 4 placements are blending together their significations sort of like paint, like sort of like when you're mixing paint and you take different colors and mix them together and it creates something new. And it's a little bit difficult for me to come up with a delineation of what all of those are doing together at the same time. But certainly individually, we could interpret some of the tendencies of what their significations would be bringing to the table in terms of the 10th house, if it was just that planet, and then sort of infer from there where it might go. So Uranus, on the positive side of things, is going to make it so that either your career or your reputation will probably need to tend towards representing something unique or something innovative or something sort of odd or strange in some way, something that stands
you do
outside
see
of the
my
norm.
username, right?
Sure, it's a cult fan.
I was joking. To your point, I mean, because that's
yeah. Well, and that has to do with also the Saturn in the 9th ruling the 11th, and that's probably where I think you'll end up going in the long term in terms of some of those occult and sort of metaphysical or other type themes and the connection with groups. I think that's part of where that's coming from. But certainly there will have to be in a positive sense, like a unique, almost like rebellious component to the career matters as that Uranus placement is tied in with the midheaven. The downside is that can sometimes create an instability or a situation in which reversals could happen potentially when that placement is activated. So I don't necessarily see anything coming up on that soon. You actually completed the Uranus transit through Pisces quite a while ago where you would have had that square. So you don't necessarily have another Uranus sort of transit coming up very soon in terms of that. Anyways, so the Uranus component bringing something unique to the table, but also potentially a little bit lacking in stability. The Mars component, that's actually the most challenging placement in your chart because you have a day chart. And so it's bringing some sort of combative or potentially a component that has to do with strife to the 10th house sphere. And typically the way that I see that working out with a lot of clients is more like having issues with 10th house type people like superiors. So sometimes issues with superiors or people that are in a superior position over you as being a potential issue. What is that ruling? It's ruling the 9th house, which has to do with beliefs or education, and the 2nd house, which has to do with financial matters. So it could be that there's something about like your beliefs that ends up causing the potential for conflict with people that are in a superior position, since Mars is in the 10th house and could potentially be detrimental in a financial sense, since it's the ruler of the 2nd house. So I guess I would be careful about not adopting an overly combative approach when it comes to your personal system of belief, because it could have a negative effect financially is one of the delineations I would come up with if I was trying to combine all three of those placements to produce a more specific delineation. And then finally, the Neptune placement in the 10th house. And that one's probably the one that's the trickiest, because when Neptune is tied in with the 10th house, part of the theme that becomes like a recurring theme throughout the life is just the search for, what you're supposed to be doing, but the search itself being part of the process and being the point itself, and not necessarily fully knowing if you've reached the end destination at any point, but eventually becoming sort of okay with that and learning that part of it is just the process. So that's the one that's probably a little bit tricky, just because whenever Neptune is like brought into play, when there's like a specific question at hand in a certain part of the life, part of the answer is that is basically that you can't fully answer it, because there's always going to be this sense of nebulousness surrounding that specific area. So for you, that'll partially be your 10th house and your career and your reputation. But I would just say that it seems like that doesn't necessarily have to be a deal breaker or something that works against you, but instead, in some instances, I've seen people be able to use that sense of nebulousness proactively and sort of build it into their career, so that instead of doing something with their reputation where, you know, everything is just fully clear and on the table, that they actually build some sense of mysteriousness or obscurity into their reputation in a way that works for them, where they make it work for them instead of having it be something that works on them or sort of plagues them in some way. So Athena in the chat says, I know a lot of artists with Neptune in the 10th. Yeah, that's a common placement, because it's like they're taking some of the artistic tendencies of Neptune and actually putting it to work. So are there any areas or careers that you've gravitated towards, that you're thinking about, that might be in alignment with any of that? Or,
I mean,
or
like,
where are you at?
I've always liked the word ma, like, because you're, you know, like eating your money. I like ma, MAW, for musician, artist, writer. I mean, that's what I feel I'm supposed to do, but I'm incredibly floaty. It's hard for me to focus. I don't necessarily, like, I make really crazy cool acoustic music, like you can feel it, but like, I like to play, I like to make something amazing, and then I'm like, move on. So I have a discipline problem.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what I would like to do. I mean, for the creative side of me, I would love to be on stage making music, doing poetry. I mean, I can move people, I can impact them, like, somehow. I mean, some of my brothers think I should be a professor, and that's creative. But like, I would like to be, if I could do anything I want to do, musician, artist, writer, all the way.
Sure. Yeah. And Athena's making another comment, which is really good, which is that she said that's why you need a partner, like you said, someone to be the structure to your flow.
True. Yeah, I need some. I do. I mean, and that's so true.
Sure.
I don't. Yeah.
So part of that is just you know, having a Pisces ascendant, having a watery ascendant, and then having all those fire planets in the 10th. That's really one of the main, you know, planets in your chart that would be balancing things out. Would be that Mercury planet in the more earthy, sort of detail-oriented Virgo, as a counterbalance to the fire placements in the 10th, as well as the Neptune placement. In addition, even though it's out of sign and it's like 6 degrees away, Neptune is pretty close to your Jupiter. So that's kind of having some impact there as well, in terms of Jupiter otherwise setting the life direction, but Neptune also having some impact in terms of making that a little bit murkier than it might be otherwise.
I see.
So,
wow.
Yeah, I would just, you know, the main themes then here are just gravitating towards those 11th and 9th house placements, I think, as being a major thing. Gravitating towards the 7th house placements in partnership as being a helpful thing in structuring. And that word structure actually is also applicable to the Jupiter placement in the 11th house, because structure is a great Capricorn keyword. So finding ways to bring and import and actually create structures within the context of the 11th house would probably be one of your main life themes, I would think, overall in the end, just in terms of having the ruler of the ascendant and the ruler of the 10th in Capricorn in the 11th whole sign house, and having it be Jupiter in a day chart, so that the role that you would play in other people's life, especially other friends and groups that you're associated with, would be building things up and creating things, as opposed to, you know, the opposite in terms of taking things away or tearing things down or what have you.
I heard you mention, I understand that. I mean, isn't that so apt that we are Freemasons in that way? But well, we being me, but there's a few others of us. But my point was that you just mentioned the 9th house. Did you mean 10th or 9th?
I mentioned the 9th partially just because I keep going back to the ruler of your 11th house and the ruler of Jupiter being Saturn, which is placed in the 9th whole sign house. So I think that's where the Freemason thing comes from. That's where the interest in occult things comes from. And I think that's really a large part of the key to your chart, is not just the ruler of the ascendant in the 10th and the 11th, but the fact that the ruler of the 11th is in the 9th. So it's that interplay between the 9th and the 11th that probably brings the most clarity to your chart in terms of both your interests as well as some part of your overall life direction.
I'm obviously not going to be able to process this all this evening, but yeah, I just want to thank you. I don't want to take up any more of your time. I guess
Yeah.
I'd finish. Go ahead.
Thanks for sharing your chart and thanks for joining me on this.
Yeah.
This is a bit of an experiment. I've never done this before. And usually, if this was an actual consultation, we would sit for like 75 minutes and take the time to go through every part of your chart and talk about more of your life history and your trajectory up to this point, as well as where things are headed in the future. And I would try to pull out some other techniques and stuff to look at. But in terms of just trying to do a short treatment of a few key themes, I hope we've been able to touch on
Absolutely
and give a little bit of insight into a few of them.
Absolutely. I would like to finish by saying that the two things. I recently became a Patreon member of the Astrology podcast. So cheers.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
It's long overdue. And I guess like the occult side of me wants to gift a little cool knowledge. That you mentioned the 9 and the 11th houses, and obviously there's those numbers, but people should look into that's a mirror number in Roman numerals. That's IXXI, which is super magically significant if you're attempting a ritual. And secondly, note the day that it happened on, Mars Day, right? So I just thought I don't think too many people talk about 9/11 happening on a Mars Day, and I think that's kind of something that's worthy of, what's that about? Why not Venus Day did that happen? So
sure. Yeah, there's a lot of things about the days of the week and numerology that I've always meant to get into more, but that's definitely worth looking into.
Well, maybe we could partner up sometime.
Yeah. Maybe for the next live stream, that'll have to be a discussion topic for the future.
Well, that would be great. Thank you so much for your help. And thank you, everyone in the chat room who's had useful comments. Thank you so much. And God bless.
Yeah. Thanks for joining me tonight. All right. Well, I think then I'm going to go ahead and I think I might call it a night, just because I think we're going on 2 or 2.5 or 3 hours or something ridiculous like that, when this was just supposed to be a very brief experiment where I was going to try live streaming and see if I could actually take questions from the audience. So I'm actually going to be doing this for real tomorrow with my friend Kelly Surtees. And tomorrow afternoon, let me look up the time really quickly so I'm certain and I can give you guys so it's going to start at approximately 3 p.m. tomorrow, May 1st, 2018, 3 p.m. Mountain Time here in Denver. Kelly and I are going to get on here and we're going to live stream a discussion where we're going to take some questions from the audience, and we're going to and we're going to basically do the same thing, except in a little bit more I don't know, having Kelly here, I think it'll be a little bit easier to structure things and to do things in a little bit more orderly of a fashion. So this was an experiment, but I think it went well enough. It wasn't as polished as I would like, but I think if we do this a few times, I'll get the hang of it a little bit more, and it can become hopefully like a regular thing, either as an episode of the Astrology podcast or as something that I do on my YouTube channel. So thanks everybody who joined me tonight. I appreciate all the comments in the chat box, and thanks for everybody that submitted a question. I really appreciate it. If we weren't able to get to your question tonight, then just join us again tomorrow. You can actually send me an email if you would like. So I'm going to put my email address in the chat box, and send me an email with your birth data and your question, and I'll see if I can get to it tomorrow with Kelly. Otherwise, try to join us live for that, and you can ask us the question in person while we're doing the live stream. All right. So so if you're not subscribed to my YouTube channel, make sure to subscribe to that for future live streams. Otherwise, you can find out more information about me on my website at theastrologypodcast.com. So thanks everyone for joining me, and I will see you again next time. All right.